What did you mean by that? That's crazy. Good morning, Minneapolis. Thank you so much for tuning in to Onsite Public Media's Good Morning Minneapolis. I am your host, Toussaint Morrison. If you want to become a member of Onsite Public Media, you can click the link below to help us fund shows like this and other shows that reach out to folks all across the Twin Cities and help people just create public media for the public. All right, today in obvious news, an Old World Colonial Institute was found to be racist. Shocker. No. Thank you, Oprah. Thank you. All right, we're going to kick off with our headlines today. There's the Thunderdome, there's the unsophistication, there's the trial, there's the cops, there's the National Guard, there's the everything, but where do we start? Let's start with the George Floyd Act. It was just passed by the U.S. House of Representatives. George Floyd was a black man who was killed by a white cop named Derek Chauvin here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And yes, as I just said, the U.S. House of Representatives just passed the George Floyd Act that will deal with racial profiling and chokeholds by police. Issue: George Floyd wasn't killed by a chokehold. The Guardian writes, while these seem like good measures, they are woefully insufficient to stop police violence. These reforms could not have even saved George Floyd's life. To be clear, Floyd did not die from a chokehold. A police officer put his knee to Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. You don't say. George Floyd didn't even die from a chokehold. The core of what happened wasn't even Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck. If we start at the symptom and work our way back to the disease, we see that the symptom is Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The disease is that a white officer believed that he could publicly execute a black man with impunity and protection under white supremacy and the badge in front of everybody and walk away scot-free. Now, addressing Derek Chauvin's core belief that he could actually do this to George Floyd and get away with it is not on the menu of the George Floyd Act. It's interesting how these public executions occur and then legislation only goes as far as they feel comfortable. And by comfortable, I mean anything that doesn't threaten their money. Now, The Guardian may have written that not even the George Floyd Act could have saved George Floyd, but let's push a little bit further and say not even the George Floyd Act could have saved Derek Chauvin or other officers from committing acts of white supremacy. Now, shifting our attention to the actual trial of Derek Chauvin, jury selection is on, where defense attorneys and prosecutors will strike jurors from a pool until they whittle it down to 12 jurors and 2 alternates who will determine if we're going to have a 9 p.m. curfew and if all lives actually do matter. CNN writes, the first juror selected was a white man in his 20s or 30s who works as a chemist and said he has an analytical mind. You know, this jury selection is starting to sound like a report from PBS. Here to speak about unhoused encampments and sustainable housing, we speak to a landlord. You know, when I'm out in the streets marching for justice and I'm thinking to mind, who's gonna bring us equity? Who's gonna bring us justice out here? Well, I think of white men in their 20s and 30s that are chemists who can think analytically. CNN continues. The fourth juror was a white man in his late 30s or 40s who said he had a very favorable view of Black Lives Matter. He also said he believed police are more truthful than other witnesses, which defeats the whole purpose of Black Lives Matter. Look, if you're saying that cops are more trustworthy than witnesses, then essentially what you're saying is that Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Thurman Blevins, Cordell Handy, Marcus Golden, Terrence Franklin, and many other black men who were gunned down by cops were justifiably killed because that cop said, hey, I feared for my life, so I shot that man. So if what this fourth juror is telling us is true, that he's Mike Freeman and he entered a time machine to de-age himself, we're in real big trouble. If that wasn't bad enough, this happened.
All right, just for the record, we had sidebar conferences in which defense made a challenge for cause. State responded and opposed that cause challenge. I think it was primarily based on her English proficiency. I denied the motion for cause basically because it did not appear that it was the language per se that was causing difficulties. It was more she's not a sophisticated witness or a sophisticated juror, but that's true of native English speakers.
Whoa. Bilingual, no thank you. Analytical chemist, yes? Question mark. The courtroom just threw this bilingual woman under the bus and she literally knows twice as many words as you. I love how Judge Cahill kind of threw it back in the defense's face and said, this could be true of any native English speaker, just to kind of keep it a buck in the room, but it felt a little bit performative, but okay, Cahill, all right. This is problematic on so many levels. So many levels. This is the trial of Derek Chauvin, the trial that the world is watching. And the courtroom just said that a Latinx woman who is bilingual cannot be a part of the jury based on the fact that they said she was not sophisticated enough and had a noticeable accent. This is insane because they're determining somebody's intelligence upon their speech, which is saying if you can't speak the language of the court, then you're not smart enough to be here. Language does not determine your intelligence. Your ability to speak a second language does not determine your intelligence. Essentially what this courtroom is saying is, if you can't speak our language, well, we're not going to make any attempt to understand you. Plus, they should have interpreters in the room. Why does she got to acquiesce to Eric Nelson and the Defend the Klan member gang? The fact that sophistication is in question in a room where Derek Chauvin is present, and it's not referring to Derek Chauvin, that's wild, man. That's real wild. And this is also a form of projection from the defense. The defense is essentially saying, well, if we don't understand her, then she must not be as sophisticated as us. It's a form of self-confessed ignorance. Congratulations, Eric Nelson. And let's take a look at Eric Nelson and the gang. This is the attorney that is defending Derek Chauvin.
I would like to give my opinion of the unjust death of George Floyd. Do you remember writing that?
Yeah, I did.
What did you mean by that?
Well, Eric, she meant that she saw a black man killed on tape, and like most of the world, she has a conscience. Also, I want to point out, why does Eric look like he's trying to hold in a fart here? Also, Eric kind of looks like he's selling you a car that he knows doesn't have an alternator, but he really, really needs to push this thing so he can get that next $200 to make sure that the utilities are paid. This dude is lying. So are you gonna buy the car or what? Also, let's point out the fact that Eric Nelson speaks like a combination of John Malkovich and Hannibal Lecter. Unjust killing? What did you mean by that when you said it? Have the lamb stopped screaming, Clarice? My client is a trained killer. He's killed before. What makes you think he would kill again? And speaking of people that know they're guilty, if you've been downtown Minneapolis, well, it looks like they're preparing for something that they know they did wrong. Yes, what some are calling the Thunderdome, the cage, Mayor Fry's new living room. It is downtown Minneapolis, and it is high chain link fences and double and triple cement barriers. And it is defending the Hennepin County Government Center and the City Hall. To speak about that, I think we're going to speak to a black man. Black man, I want to ask you really quick, how are you feeling? What were your initial sentiments when you saw the cage?
Well, it certainly felt right away that just by the optics, it looks like there won't be justice, or they're preparing for a negative outcome and expecting the city to react accordingly.
I want to ask you about the money being spent. Okay, so there's a ton of money being spent on the National Guard, the feds, different police coming in from different counties, the sheriff's department. How do you feel about tens of millions of dollars going into basically be security for this trial?
It's not a good feeling, since this was supposed to be our time to push for defunding the police, and it seems like that's the exact opposite of what's happening.
Black man on the side, I just want to ask you, if you were mayor, what would you have spent the money on? Like, what would you have done with this trial coming up?
Youth programs, youth work programs, keeping people busy throughout these summer months when we know things are going to get hot. Therapy for the youth, I think that's a big one. If you can start reconnecting kids' ability to self-regulate, these big blowouts that turn into a kid getting slammed by a police officer in school will lessen.
Black man, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, listen, if there's any morons out there that are planning to come to our city during this trial and be on some nonsense, we're ready, and we don't want you here.
And as always, we appreciate your time, sir.
Yeah, man, no worries.
And before we go, we just have one really quick news clip we want to play for you. It's a special one from us to you because it's some things that need to be said. And, you know, sometimes what needs to be said doesn't always get said, but it got said this time. Here you go.
If they can compare what the experience that I went through was similar to what has been shared with us. Kate was called Waity Katie, waiting to marry William. While I imagine that was really hard, and I can't picture what that felt like, this is not the same. And if a member of his family will comfortably say, we've all had to deal with things that are rude and racist are not the same.
Thank you so much for tuning in. That does it for us at Onsite Public Media. Good morning, Minneapolis. We love y'all. Our work is never done. We'll see you at the next action, y'all. Peace.